What does it look like when we find our own fulfillment and further our own purpose? That's what we're going to be talking about on today's podcast, dropping the veil of what we should be doing and what our world should look like. And we're going to be discussing this with Biko Casini of Rising Appalachia and the Ecovillage that followed. Make sure to stick around for the ending to hear Biko playing. Hello. Today, our podcast, ReVillaging, is welcoming Biko Casini. We're just so appreciative to have him here today, talking about his experiences with the farm, Rising Appalachia, and overall just exploring modalities of eco-grief with me.
Thanks for having me on here. And when I was asked about doing the podcast, and I thought about the topic, eco grief and solutionary thinking, it did remind me of some of the initial kind of awakening moments in my journey here on the farm. So I grew up in a place called the Farm, which is an alternative community in Tennessee, and it's been here over 50 years this year. And when I was a teenager, this place called the Global Ecovillage Network got started, called the Ecovillage Training Center. And it was one of the nodes of the Global Ecovillage Network. It was the first national center in the United States. And it was like 300 meters from my house. So I would go over there. I was already building with my dad, doing stonemasonry and carpentry. And I started learning about natural building, but more importantly, I started hanging out with people that weren't hopeless. They were people that were like, oh, this planet is having a real hard time and humans are doing a real hard number on it. But there is a way that we can be a part of making the planet more diverse, making the waters cleaner, and making our own settlements and our own ways of existing on Earth more in harmony with what is around us, the local earth, water, wood, stone that's around us. And so, yeah, it was really helpful to me because it gave me a direction of like, oh, I can be a part of this solution. I don't just have to be another leech sucking off the world. There's a way to do this different. So I just, that was what resonated with me about the topic and my own upbringing coming into it. A little bit more about my background. I'm a second generation Italian. My father's from Florence, Italy. My mom grew up in California. She's also Italian. Grew up in a hippie commune, essentially, and going to a public school 30 miles from where the Ku Klux Klan was founded. And so there was like kind of a huge gap between what the culture that surrounded me growing up and the culture that was in my home and in my more closer community. Mm-hmm. And as I kind of grew up, I got into music and realized it was a way to bridge that gap, and it was a way to reach people and share messages that don't have to kind of be so bludgeoning, but can be just inspiration or just a way of changing our reflection to be able to cope with the process of being human and trying to exist on this planet in a way that makes sense,
I just want to say, first of all, it's great to have a fellow Italian on our podcast today. With the names Cassini and Bazzata, I think that's funny. My question for you around the term eco grief and eco anxiety, what would you say is your journey around it, and what comes up for you when you hear those words?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit tricky because it's buried also in the culture of being a part of an alternative community and commune that was thought of as a communist threat to the current paradigm. So for me, I remember being 3 or 4, and kind of being aware that there were these squads of men that were paid by our government that were running around in Central and South America, like killing people, you know? And so it was a little early to realize how real the boogeyman was. In terms of the grief that I feel, a lot of it has to do with, I know that we're doing a lot to the earth, but we wouldn't do to the earth what we didn't do to each other. And, you know, earth is like rocks, minerals, water, you know, sunlight. So are we. There's really no difference. The idea that we are something, the earth is another thing, we do things to the earth, it's like, it misses the point, I think, which is that we have to treat ourselves kindly and we have to treat those around us kindly. And it doesn't matter what. There's an approach to how we live. And I think dealing with the grief, I think, is about finding the love, not about fixing the problem, because that will ensure that you will grieve forever. If your grief is tied into fixing the ecological disaster or the social disasters of the world, like, you'll just always be paralyzed or trapped in that. Are you figuring out a way to live where you're happy? And are you doing so without hurting others? Or if you are, we are, because we're talking on an iPhone. So we're directly supporting slavery by having an iPhone. It's a direct thing. And so there's some grief in that. There's some grief in knowing that we depend on a system that is destructive. But that's the question. How can we live and not contribute to that pain, to that grief, to that trauma? Like, trauma, in order to heal, has to be rewired so that when you run down the avenue that used to lead to the trauma, it leads to a different experience. And then whenever that trigger happens, it sends you to that new experience. And so we are trying to make a new experience of what life can be, where we can be happy, we can live in balance. Natives did it, but it's a different world. And even natives, you know, they do it for a couple hundred years, then it would all fall apart. Then they do it for a couple thousand years, it would fall apart. So, I mean, now we've got all this technology to deal with. We've got all this pollution to deal with. It's just a lot bigger than what kind of groceries we buy or those kind of things. You know, it's who are we? Where do we belong? And how do we live there? In people of wanting to belong to something that is an alternative to what's being presented. But there's not a lot of tremendous headway in the US in terms of projects that seem to be able to provide long-term solutions for people. There's a lot of really good transient solutions and really good transient eco-villages and really good small, you know, neighborhoods or communities where people have houses together in Portland or whatever. And it's like, there's stuff happening, but in terms of like numbers, most people are trying to figure out somewhere where they can be, where they're safe in the long term. And most of us don't have it because we depend on an unstable system. We're all feeling. Nobody has a monopoly on grief, and nobody has a monopoly on the solution.
I just want to highlight something profound that I heard you say, which is we can only treat the planet as much as we know how to treat ourselves. And that reminds me of a quote that I heard recently and has really stuck with me, which is we can only love each other as much as we can love ourselves. So the question really is, like, how do we deal with our eco grief? You know, and then find ways to create those solutions. And that's a big part of what I try to address here. And you know, I sometimes default to using words anti-system, right? Like when I um, try to tell someone randomly that's my age or younger, what is it that I do, a lot of the times I'll use words like anti-system, because that's like, the cool thing to say, or like, well, for them it's cool, for me it's like I'm just trying to like box this very holistic esoteric thing that I do, which is like eco activism, and how I try to make my mark on the world when I'm dealing with this immense grief and pain, and then also knowing that there's so many amazing solutions out there. I just like kind of box it into like, oh, we're doing anti-system things.
Let me jump
Of
in there for a
course.
second. I think, like, we have to be more than anti something.
Right.
Like, if we're anti-system, like, if you try to translate that, mean that you don't use the system? Does it mean you don't use gas? Does it mean you don't use electricity? Does it mean you don't pay taxes? Does it mean you don't pay rent? So when you say I'm anti-system, what you're saying is I'm anti-me, because
Yeah.
you're doing all of it. And some
Mhm.
of the grief that we feel is from being forced, we feel like being forced to live against our values. And that's a huge area of
100%.
grief for people. And it's not even always totally articulated. They know they'd rather be doing something else, but they're not exactly sure why. And we all feel this. But back again, it is so important to be more than anti.
Mhm.
Who are we? Where do we belong? What are we pro? If we were more clear about what we were pro, we would be way closer there than while we all sit around and argue about how anti we are about what. We need to simplify our version of what success is and stop making it about everyone else changing. Because I'm just at a different point in my life. I'm a little older. In my 20s, I kind of thought everyone was going to catch a fever and we would play more cowbell and then everything would be fine. But it isn't really working out that way. People have to find security in their heart. Nobody will do what you want them to do if they don't feel like it's going to make them safe.
I'm so glad that you just went in depth on that subject, because that's something that I was really addressing in an earlier podcast, like this idea that we're starting here and we have to know where our collective visioning is. And I just feel like it evokes another quote that I read, which was about what our purpose is. And that's something I feel like humans as a society and as a whole are not asking enough. And this idea that we're just so separate from nature, because we're not separate, right? And that could be debatable, but I don't think that we are. And so this idea of, well, what is it that we want to see when we feel that we're more whole with the earth, and what happens when we stop being anti and we start being pro. And I agree with you, like I don't necessarily think anti is the right phrasing. I think it's just easier for people to digest, yet I do think that being pro for me means like collective visioning. So like we start here and we say, oh, we want to stop that and we want to stop this, and things like Greenpeace or being a vegan, and then move it. It's not going to work effectively unless we decide like, oh, this is what we want to start creating together, or and that could be different for people, but it's like refocusing, and I find that to be really important. So, you talked about the farm a little bit, and it's something I would love to hear more. What inspired you throughout your life there, or maybe even became disillusioned?
the farm is an amazing countercultural, historical experiment. One of the issues in the rest of the world is it was really hard to protect that because everyone had to survive. And it got to a point where it was like, all right, we got to kind of put down this hippie thing. And they became the yuppies. We had to make it, we had to survive. And so it was sort of like not airy fairy flu rainbow puff the magic dragon hippies, but just people that believed in nature and the energy of nature and loving kindness and compassion and nonviolence and things like that. Not that we were good at those things, because what you aspire to and what you're good at are not always the same thing. It takes work, and yeah, you asked me about going to public school. That's just poverty. Private school costs money. To make your own school, I mean, you have to buy the books, you have to pay the teachers or somehow compensate the teachers. So only the students whose parents taught at the farm school were able to go to the farm school. I went to Summertown School, which was a local school, and they tried. They were still reading Bibles in classes and hitting students with boards and all of that kind of stuff. And there are ways to talk to people that can de-escalate situations. Not that I'm always good at it, again, but it's something to learn about. And anyway, back to the farm. I was finally in high school, I was able to come to the farm school because I could earn enough money to pay for some of my tuition. And then at the same year, I got into playing music. I got into playing drums. We started a band. I got into permaculture at the Ecovillage Training Center. So my teenage years were like really full power charge. It was really cool. Good experience growing up here. And really the thing that inspired me the most was getting involved with Plenty, which was our kind of global relief organization, which has a program called Kids to the Country, where we bring kids from the inner city, Nashville, Memphis, Atlanta, different places, working with a lot of refugees from around the world and a lot of children from Center for Drug Addicted Parents, and bring them down to the farm for 4 days. And it made me want to understand more how to share what the farm has with people that really don't. And not to say anything snidey, I'll just say that in my journeys since then, a lot of times as I travel and I see projects, at least the projects that I get exposed to, it's often, yoga centers and community centers and different things like that. And I've been really interested in mentorship centers that are focused on providing those experiences for people that have a harder time just getting on a plane and going to Panama, for example, to a trance festival or something, But if the focus of the journey is on the actual experience and not on the outcome, not on we're going to make this, numbers are going to change by 2030, this many people will do this or whatever, but focus on quality experiences that allow people to unhinge from their trauma and ground into something beautiful. That's it. And that's all, as far as I'm concerned. Much I'm in this place of like figuring out what sovereignty looks like and how to offer experiences and exchanges that have meaning for people, that give people their own opportunity to make their own decisions and have their own growth, and not try to push an agenda that forces people to not be who they are and to be someone else. That's my thoughts.
That's something that I really want to bring to this podcast, because in a lot of my work, what I talk about a lot is like pigeonholing one solution, which for me is ecovillages, and that's something that I'm really excited about. And I do think that will bring a lot to solution-based thinking, and it definitely has inspired me, but also yeah, just really sitting with that there are many solutions, and not eco-villages are not something that's super accessible to everyone. So yeah, I just find that to be really valid, what you're talking about. And also, like, you know, when we talk about BIPOC people and different representations and what privileges, I do think it's important to say, like, yeah, those solutions aren't available for everyone. You know, I know you're familiar with Soul Fire Farms, and they're doing a lot as far as like creating sovereignty and autonomy um, with people of color. And I just find that to be, you know, something that I'm really passionate about, and just in awe of things that they and similar people are doing. Um, what would be one thing that you feel like is solutions that you've been working on and that you're bringing? I do find you to be like a very solutionary person, and people really look up to you. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
You know, lately, it's been a tough time for everybody. It's been tough for me. I've been going up and down. I've been erratic and emotional. Um, but in that, what seems to be holding true for me is to give time and energy to the things that I love. And for me, that's making instruments. I make a lot of instruments. I really enjoy it. I just like the feeling of creating things. I am planning on starting my house in the spring, and
Nice.
I do a lot of work sort of imagining and designing systems for building domes and vaults and with hempcrete and other materials, and just thinking about more efficient ways to get the materials into the buildings. Um, so I spend a lot of time puzzling through architecture and machines, and then I spend a lot of time making my instruments. And I've really at home, I've really slowed down the social thing, because I realized that the community's agenda is not necessarily my agenda. And it doesn't mean
Mm-hmm.
that it doesn't mean that I disagree with my community, but it means that, like, if I have an agenda, I need to be clear about what it is for myself. And I think that if I was going to talk about a solution that I'm feeling right now, I would say one of the most important steps is cutting out the stuff that is not essential
Mm-hmm.
to you. And what I mean by that is, like, forget all of the feelings of like this big external obligation that keeps everyone stressed out all the time. It's like, what does it actually look like to be creative and give time and energy to the things that we love? And also think about, like, like, people have to survive. And I believe that everybody, if they believed in it, had something they could focus on that they could survive doing. And sometimes you have to relight it. Nobody believes in them all the time. Everybody goes up and down. And so I think having the fire to believe enough to keep working on it is a part of the solution. Because when we talk about purpose for humanity, it's too diverse. And the only way to do that, in my opinion, is to be able to spend time and energy with what they really love. Now, people could argue that, like, some people love money and some people love da 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 da. That could also be a good thing. That person could really be empowering a lot of other people who love other things. So I think there's a way, but my solutions lately have been trying to uncouple from the pressures I put on myself to be a certain way, and rather just trying to understand how I do need to be and what's happening, and how I can figure out a way to be happy and survive. doesn't make me any more noble than anyone else. You know, it's the same work that everyone in the world is doing. And, you know, I just have the benefit of getting exposed to more life options.
Yeah.
I have more different options that I can look at, and some of them are pretty juicy, you know, and the ecological awareness is really sweet. Being able to know how to deal with water and grow food is huge asset. But again, it's just, I've had experiences that some people don't, and therefore I'm aware of different possibilities. And that's where I think the solution for me is having the experiences that bring me that joy, and then finding ways to curate and cultivate as many of those experiences as possible where people can get exposed to something that is inspiring to them.
Yeah, you know, I think that awareness is really key. You know, something that I teach about in my ecovillages workshops are uh, different communities and the ones that are really inspiring. And I might not necessarily want to live like them, but, you know, there are just a lot of different exciting options out there. Like one of them is Cure, and that is a huge eco village, probably one of the largest in the world in northern Italy. And you know, I teach these people about how Cure organize a group of people to dig with spoons and create this temple that was hidden for over 20 years to the Italian government. Now, you know, they live there legally and everything's okay, but it's just like, you know, what happens when you organize a group of people, and now they're living, you know, over 1,000 people together, and are just like renowned in so many different things. And I just, you know, like I said, I don't necessarily want to live like them. Yeah, I think it's nice for people to have options. So, yeah, I totally appreciate, like, you know, once you do have those options, what do you do with them? And I think you're bringing up some valid points around that. So I think that's all for me. And I would love to hear more of what's in your mind. And then let's get into some music.
Well, I guess I'm really excited about the next couple of months to see how things all play out. We're going on a tour down to New Orleans and then over to Austin and Santa Fe. So I'm really pumped about creating more music. I've been recording. Let's see. I have like my little Ngoni recording.
Nice.
See it? Where is it? I can't see. Anyway, yeah, I've been recording with my Ngoni and my setup. And so, yeah, I'm really inspired about making music, aside from building my own shelter, and hopefully in such a way that will help me inspire others. I'm going to give the viewers a view of what's going on in my home. This is the one you were talking about. This is Kalamata.
Yeah.
I've been loving the music. I mean, it's not a ton happening in terms of gigs, but there's a lot of new music coming out of people right now, you know, making what's beautiful inside of us come to life. Like everything else is a distraction that's trying to keep us from living a happy life, in my opinion. And what's beautiful inside of us is probably got value to other people. All right. So this Ngoni has a really cool story. West Africa to come to the United States, and to move to Asheville, North Carolina. And he built this Ngoni. He did this tack work and this leather on the day he left. And he put the Ngoni together and flew to the States with holding it with him. The neck came apart, then the skin tore. So he gave me the gourd, and I did another skin on top of the old skin and made a new neck and a new bridge. But then even that, it wasn't really working. So I took it apart again and redid it one more time. And because sometimes for whatever reason, you have to keep working on them until they feel good. And I really like how it's feeling now.
Wow, beautiful.
Although it's still settling in with the new strings. I tuned it this week. There it is. That's the culprit. There we go. It takes a powerful blow to shape stone, and the power in our hands, and the hammer in our hands. Wild forces, they rule our destiny, the path on which we stand. And swift as the wind, love dances before us, singing "Catch Me If You Can," singing "Catch Me If You Can." We feel it in our bones, we feel it in our bones, in our bones. We feel it in our bones, in our bones. We feel it in our bones, in our bones. We feel it in our bones.
A big thank you for Biko Casini's performance and overall great guest speaker. Next podcast, we're going to have Salix Levine talking about eco-grief from a psychological perspective. And we'll also be going into a community that both of us have been that is just mind-blowing. And you get a little bit of a taste of that here.
A little
Stay tuned
teaser
for podcast
because
number 3.
because I have ecological grief, and I think that is the first way in which I started to understand what is ecological grief is by feeling it. Actually,
we had acting class, and I was like rolling around with 80-year-old people, 60 to 80-year-old people on the floor and like singing, and it wasn't like a weird thing. Like, I mean, we're all clothed. I've been watching these cult things, but anyway.